Justice Mia Caldwell adjusted the lapel of her tailored jacket as she stepped into the first-class cabin. The muted hum of the jet engines already familiar. It wasn't her first time in this space where the seats were wide, the air cooler, and the service noticeably more attentive. Yet, there was always something about air travel that unsettled her. Perhaps it was the inescapable closeness to strangers or the feeling of being confined in a space too small to hold her quiet dignity. Today, the weight of her title felt heavy, though invisible. Supreme Court Justice. It was a position she had earned through decades of resilience, perseverance, and quiet fortitude. She never announced her role unless necessary. Her work, she believed, should speak louder than her name. Mia settled into her seat, smoothing the fabric of her dress, a gift from an old friend who had insisted she look the part. The dress was understated yet elegant, its deep blue fabric gleaming faintly in the overhead light. As she buckled her seatbelt, she allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. This trip wasn't just another hearing or conference. She was traveling to give a lecture at a law school about the power of justice, both the kind written into law and the kind found in the choices people make every day. The first-class cabin was beginning to fill with the usual assortment of passengers. A young man, likely a tech entrepreneur, wrestled with his carry-on, grumbling as he tried to fit it into the overhead bin. Across the aisle, an older woman leafed through a well-worn novel, her expression serene. The soft rustle of newspapers mingled with the faint clink of glassware as flight attendants moved through the aisles, their smiles polished and their steps practiced. Mia often marveled at the rhythm of flights, the predictable rituals, the announcements, the safety demonstration. The steady hum of engines created an illusion of order in an otherwise chaotic world. She appreciated that, even as her mind turned to the work she had brought with her. A manila folder lay in her briefcase, filled with documents for an environmental case that had been occupying her thoughts for weeks. A small, underfunded community was suing a massive corporation over waste disposal practices that had poisoned their water supply. To Mia, it was the kind of case that defined why she had chosen the law, to give voice to those too often ignored. Yet, even with her focus on the task ahead, she couldn't ignore the subtle tension that accompanied her presence in certain spaces. It was a feeling she knew well, honed over years of navigating boardrooms, courtrooms, and public spaces where her very existence challenged unspoken assumptions. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Mia's gaze wandered to the flight attendants making their final rounds. One of them, a tall woman with sharp features and an equally sharp smile, caught her attention. Her name tag read Samantha York. Something in Samantha's gaze lingered too long on Mia, her eyes traveling from the Supreme Court Justice's face to her dress and back again. It wasn't curiosity, it was something more deliberate, almost calculated. Mia's chest tightened slightly, but she willed herself to remain composed. This wasn't new. The subtle pauses, the fleeting looks of doubt, the unspoken questions, "Do you belong here?" She had encountered them all before, and she had learned long ago how to let them wash over her without reaction. But the look from Samantha carried a weight she couldn't quite shake. The engines roared softly as the plane began to taxi. Mia leaned back into her seat, watching the runway lights blur into streaks. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Samantha walk past her row, the flight attendant's stride purposeful, as Samantha brushed against her arm. Despite the ample space in the aisle, Mia felt the deliberate nature of the gesture. It was subtle, too subtle for anyone else to notice, but it was there. Unmistakable. Mia inhaled deeply, the words of her mother rising unbidden in her mind. They can only make you feel small if you let them. Baby. Her mother had been her first teacher in resilience. A woman who had raised her family with grace and determination despite the challenges they faced. Mia let the memory ground her as the plane lifted off, the world shrinking below them. For the next several minutes, the cabin settled into quiet activity. Passengers unfolded newspapers, adjusted their reclines, and began to disappear into their private worlds. Mia opened her briefcase, pulling out the manila folder, her fingers brushing the edge of a familiar photo tucked inside. It was of her grandmother, who had been a laundress in her youth and one of the first to teach Mia the power of dignity. The older woman had always stood tall, no matter what the world threw her way. Mia focused on the legal briefs in front of her, but her mind drifted. She thought of all the times she had faced moments like this: a server who ignored her in a restaurant, a security guard who questioned her credentials, a stranger who assumed she was someone else entirely. Each instance, though small, had left an imprint. Together, they told a story of how prejudice didn't always announce itself loudly, it often whispered, subtle and insidious, chipping away at confidence and belonging. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. Mia's attention was drawn to Samantha again, who was now interacting with another passenger. Her tone was bright, her smile warm. But Mia couldn't ignore the contrast in how she had been treated just moments before. The subtlety of the flight attendant's earlier actions gnawed at her, not because it was new, but because it was so familiar. As dinner service began, Mia straightened in her seat, determined to focus on her work. The hum of the engines created a steady backdrop, almost meditative, as she turned her attention to the pages in front of her. Yet, the lingering unease remained, like a shadow stretching across the quiet comfort of the cabin. Sometimes, Mia thought, the fight for justice wasn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it was simply about refusing to let others define your worth in spaces where you were meant to feel small. The dress clung softly to her as she shifted in her seat, a quiet symbol of pride and defiance. She had worn it because it reminded her of who she was. A woman who had walked into rooms where she wasn't expected and had stayed long enough to change them. Above the clouds, she resolved to do the same here. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang tiang on Viet Chuan Tu Hap Dan Quan Hat Nuoi Dak Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chuyen Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Then. Tram Lang. Nan Man Suma Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Bi Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hong Ge Dat Doi Tuong Nuin Ila Nuoi Sin Song Tam I Vako Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. Chat GPT de Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 2, The First Cut. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign turning off was followed by the quiet shuffle of passengers adjusting themselves for the long flight ahead. Justice Mia Caldwell unfolded her napkin carefully and placed it on her lap, her movements slow and deliberate. Years in the courtroom had taught her the power of composure, that even in the face of discomfort, dignity could be armor. The first-class cabin, so often advertised as a haven of comfort, felt different tonight. The hum of the engines created a steady backdrop, but there was an undercurrent of tension Mia couldn't quite ignore. It wasn't a storm. Not yet, just a shift in the air. Samantha York, the flight attendant with the sharp smile, reappeared, her cart gliding smoothly down the aisle. Mia noticed the precision of Samantha's movements as she served each passenger, her tone warm and professional. But when Samantha reached Mia's row, something changed. Her smile stiffened, and her gaze lingered too long, as if she were searching for something to confirm an unspoken suspicion. Your dinner choice? Samantha asked, her tone neutral but edged with a coolness that wasn't present moments earlier. The chicken, please, Mia replied, her voice calm and measured. She had learned long ago that restraint often spoke louder than words. As Samantha placed the tray on Mia's table, Her hand jerked slightly, sloshing water dangerously close to the rim of the glass. It wasn't enough to spill, but the motion felt deliberate, calculated in a way that others might dismiss as clumsiness. Mia's eyes flicked up to meet Samantha's, but the flight attendant was already looking away, fussing with the cart. "That's quite a dress," Samantha remarked, her tone casual on the surface but heavy with something else. "Must have cost a pretty penny." The words hung in the air between them, and Mia recognized the implication immediately. It wasn't a compliment, it was a question, thinly veiled and loaded. A question about belonging. About whether someone like Mia could or should possess something so fine. "It was a gift," Mia replied softly, her voice steady. She didn't elaborate. She didn't owe an explanation. Not to Samantha or anyone else. Samantha's smile didn't reach her eyes. "A gift," she repeated, the skepticism in her tone unmistakable. "How nice for you." She moved on, but the weight of her words lingered around Mia. The cabin remained quiet. The passengers absorbed in their own worlds, reading, scrolling through their phones, or nodding off to the soothing hum of the engines. To anyone watching, the exchange might have seemed insignificant, a passing comment easily forgotten. But Mia knew better. These small moments weren't small at all. They were part of something larger. Something that chipped away at the foundations of dignity, one comment at a time. Mia exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the edge of her napkin. She had faced far greater challenges than this. She had argued cases before the highest courts, navigated rooms where her presence alone was enough to unsettle those who believed power belonged to them alone. Yet, here in this confined space, the sting of Samantha's words felt sharper than she expected. Across the aisle, an elderly woman glanced up from her book, her expression unreadable. Mia wondered if she had noticed. She wondered if anyone had. For a moment, their eyes met, and the woman gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to her novel. It was a gesture so subtle it could have meant nothing or everything. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jostling the trays and causing a few passengers to grip their armrests. Mia took the moment to steady herself, both physically and emotionally. The dress she wore, the one Samantha had so pointedly commented on, was more than just fabric. It was a reminder of her journey, of the spaces she had entered and remained in despite the unspoken doubts of others. The turbulence subsided, but the unease in the cabin did not. Samantha returned to Mia's row, this time with a clipped request, "I'll need to see your boarding pass." Mia looked up, surprised. "My boarding pass?" "Yes. Just a routine check," Samantha replied, her tone brisk. It wasn't routine. Mia had flown countless times, and she knew well enough that boarding passes were checked before takeoff, not mid-flight. But she said nothing. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her bag and handed over the slip of paper. Samantha took it, scrutinizing it with an intensity that felt unwarranted. "Government rate," Samantha murmured, her voice barely audible but loud enough for Mia to hear. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced back at Mia. "What exactly do you do for the government?" The question wasn't innocent. Mia had heard it before, in different forms, from different mouths. It was a challenge, a way of asking, "Who are you to sit here?" She felt the familiar frustration bubble up, but she suppressed it, choosing instead the quiet strength that had carried her through similar moments in the past. "I work in the judicial system," Mia replied simply, her tone measured. Samantha handed back the boarding pass, her expression tight. her smile brittle. Well, everything seems to be in order, she said, though her tone suggested she still had doubts. As Samantha moved on, Mia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Across the aisle, the elderly woman set down her book and leaned slightly toward Mia. Some people just can't help showing their true colors. Can they? She said softly. Mia managed a faint smile, grateful for the woman's quiet solidarity. The words were a reminder that even in moments of isolation, there were allies. However small their gestures might seem. The plane's engines droned on, steady and unchanging, as if indifferent to the quiet dramas unfolding within its cabin. Outside, the night sky stretched vast and unyielding, the stars obscured by clouds. Mia stared out the window, her reflection superimposed over the darkness, and thought about how far she had come and how far the world still had to go. In the stillness of the cabin, with only the soft murmur of conversation and the rustle of newspapers breaking the silence, she resolved to hold her ground. Not out of pride, but out of principle. Because justice, she knew, wasn't just about laws in courtrooms. Sometimes, it was about the quiet refusal to let anyone make you feel small. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang tiang on Viet Chuang 3 hap dan quan hat nuoi dak bang jong van tram lang. Kak quan, jong van qua ka chuyen kong qua kich tin ma ko fan van then. Tram lang. Nan man suma thuan gam qua van de fan bi chung tak trong doi song hong ge dat doi tuong nuin ila nuoi sin song tam I vako du tuoi trend 65 tuoi. Chat GPT de Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 3, A Public Scene. The clink of glassware and the low murmur of voices filled the cabin as the dinner service continued. Justice Mia Caldwell adjusted her tray table, her appetite dulled but her composure intact. The meal before her was artfully arranged, but she barely noticed. Her focus remained on the quiet tension that lingered in the air, an undercurrent that felt almost tangible. She had long grown accustomed to such moments, subtle slights that others might not notice but that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The comment about her dress, the unnecessary request for her boarding pass, none of it was new. What lingered was the steady erosion, the quiet but persistent reminder that even in a seat she had rightfully earned, her presence could still be questioned. Across the aisle, the elderly woman Agnes Wright, Mia had learned from a passing introduction, continued to read her novel. Though her glances toward Mia betrayed her distraction, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared awareness of the dynamics at play. Agnes's small gestures of support, the tissues she had offered earlier, the quiet words of solidarity were enough to anchor Mia amid the turbulence of the evening. Samantha York's return was marked by the sound of her cart rolling down the aisle. Her movements were practiced and deliberate, her professional demeanor firmly in place. Yet when she stopped at Mia's row, the air seemed to shift once more. "Excuse me," Samantha said. Her tone clipped. "Could you adjust your dress? It's obstructing the aisle." Mia blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Her dress, while elegant and fitted, barely grazed her knees. It was hardly the voluminous obstruction Samantha implied. Around her, passengers stirred, their attention subtly drawn to the exchange. "My dress is not obstructing the aisle," Mia replied evenly, her voice measured. Samantha's smile tightened. "First class has certain standards," she said, her tone pointed. "Not everyone understands that." The words landed with a quiet thud, their meaning unmistakable. Mia felt her pulse quicken but willed herself to remain calm. She met Samantha's gaze, steady and unflinching. "I assure you," Mia said softly, "I am well aware of the standards." The exchange hung in the air, A silent tug-of-war that neither woman seemed willing to break. It wasn't until Agnes set her book down with an audible thump that the tension shifted. "Excuse me," Agnes said, her voice firm and clear. "I've been flying first class for decades, and I've never seen a dress obstruct an aisle before. Perhaps the problem isn't the dress." Her words rippled through the cabin, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Samantha's professional mask faltered for a brief moment, her cheeks flushing as she glanced around. Her gaze darted to Agnes, then back to Mia. Before she mumbled a curt, "I'll check with the galley," she moved on, her cart rolling forward with unnecessary force. The faint clatter of utensils betrayed her frustration, but she said nothing further. Agnes turned to Mia, her expression softening. "Some people need a reminder," she said quietly. "Though I suppose they rarely get one." "Thank you," Mia replied, her voice equally quiet. "It's rare to have someone speak up." Agnes gave a small nod, her gaze thoughtful. "When you've lived as long as I have," she said, "you start to regret the times you didn't." The cabin returned to its subdued rhythm, but the undercurrent of unease remained. Mia could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, their curiosity mingling with something more complicated, perhaps guilt, perhaps shame. She wondered how many of them had witnessed what had happened and had chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to remain silent. The faint hum of the engines seemed louder now, filling the space where words might have been. Mia focused on the view outside the window, where the dark expanse of the sky stretched endlessly. The clouds below glowed faintly in the moonlight, a quiet reminder of the vastness of the world and her place within it. She thought of the community she was fighting for in the case that awaited her, a small, overlooked town battling a corporation that saw them as expendable. Their fight was not so different from the one she faced now. Both were battles against systems that devalued people, reducing them to obstacles or inconveniences. When Samantha returned, her demeanor had shifted. Her tone was neutral, almost mechanical, as she collected trays and refilled drinks. But the way she handled Mia's tray, a quick, dismissive motion, was enough to rekindle the tension. It was a quiet act, easily ignored by those who didn't want to see. But Mia felt it deeply. "Is there something else you need?" Mia asked, her voice calm but firm. The question, so simple on the surface, carried an unmistakable weight. Samantha hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "No, nothing else," she replied. Her tone clipped. "Just doing my job." The businessman beside Mia, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "I think we're all set here," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. His tone was steady, but his words carried the authority of someone unafraid to disrupt the status quo. Samantha's composure cracked ever so slightly. Without another word, she turned and pushed the cart down the aisle, her movements brisk and deliberate. The cabin settled into silence once more. But the atmosphere had shifted. The faint clink of glasses and the rustle of papers seemed louder now, as if filling the void left by the confrontation. Mia leaned back in her seat, her fingers brushing against the dried water stain on her dress. It was a small mark, barely noticeable, but it felt emblematic of the evening, a reminder of how easily dignity could be tarnished, even in the smallest ways. As the plane continued its journey through the night, Mia resolved to hold on to her composure. Not out of pride, but out of necessity. She knew that moments like these weren't just about her, they were about everyone who had ever felt their place questioned, their worth diminished by the quiet cruelty of assumption. Justice, she reminded herself, wasn't always loud. Sometimes It was found in the quiet refusal to be erased. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang tiang on Viet Chuan for hap dan quan hat nuoi dak bang jong van tram lang. Kak quan, jong van qua ka chuyen con qua kich tin ma ko fan van then. Tram lang. Nan man suma thuan gam qua van de fan bi chung tak trong doi song hong ge dat doi tuong nuin ila nuoi sin song tam I vako du tuoi trend 65 tuoi. Chat GPT de Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 4, Rising Tensions. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane continued its steady path through the night sky. Outside, the darkness stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the occasional flash of light from the wing. Inside, the hum of the engines filled the space, masking the faint rustle of passengers adjusting in their seats or flipping through magazines. Yet for Justice Mia Caldwell, the calm exterior of the flight was a thin veneer, unable to hide the undercurrent of tension that lingered just below the surface. Mia leaned back in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, though her fingers occasionally tapped against the leather. It was a small, unconscious habit she had picked up over years of sitting on judicial benches, a way to steady herself when the weight of a moment threatened to shift her focus. Tonight, the weight wasn't from legal arguments or high-profile decisions, it came from the quiet, unrelenting friction of being seen, yet not truly seen. Samantha York's presence, though physically absent for now, still loomed. Her clipped tone, her questioning gaze, and her pointed remarks about Mia's dress had left an imprint that was hard to shake. These weren't overt acts of discrimination, but the subtle, insidious kind that Mia knew all too well. The kind that could be explained away as coincidence or miscommunication, but that left a sting nonetheless. Across the aisle, Agnes Wright adjusted her blanket, her book now closed and resting on her lap. She glanced at Mia, her expression calm but watchful. There was a quiet solidarity in the older woman's gaze, one that reminded Mia of her grandmother, a woman who had endured a lifetime of small slights with grace and strength. Agnes gave a small nod, as if to say, "I see you." Mia returned the nod, grateful for the unspoken support. It was a reminder that even in moments of isolation, there were those who chose to bear witness. The click of heels against the cabin floor drew Mia's attention. Samantha had returned, her movements brisk and deliberate as she navigated the aisle with a garbage bag in hand. As she reached Mia's row, her posture stiffened, and her gaze flicked briefly to the dried water stain on Mia's dress. "Trash?" Samantha asked, her tone flat, though the way she leaned across Mia's seat felt unnecessarily abrupt. Mia shook her head. "No thank you." But Samantha lingered a moment too long, the bag brushing against Mia's arm in what might have been an accident or might not. "These aisles are so narrow," Samantha muttered, her voice low but audible enough for Mia to hear. There was no apology in her tone, only the faint trace of a challenge. Mia didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that reacting too quickly could give people like Samantha the satisfaction they sought. Instead, she straightened slightly in her seat, her posture calm and composed. "I understand," Mia said evenly, her voice carrying just enough weight to suggest that she saw through Samantha's actions without needing to call them out directly. Samantha's eyes met Mia's for a brief second, then darted away. She moved on, leaving behind the faint scent of tension in her wake. The interaction, brief as it was, didn't go unnoticed. The businessman seated next to Mia shifted slightly, his laptop screen glowing with rows of spreadsheets. He glanced at her, his brow furrowed as if trying to decide whether to say something. Across the aisle, Agnes adjusted her glasses and turned slightly in her seat, her gaze following Samantha as she moved down the aisle. Mia could feel the weight of their attention, But she said nothing. There was a fine line between standing firm and becoming a spectacle. And she had spent years learning how to navigate it. In the courtroom, she wielded her voice like a scalpel, cutting through arguments with precision and authority. But here, in the confined space of an airplane cabin, the rules were different. She turned her attention to the window, watching as the faint glow of city lights far below came into view. They reminded her of constellations, each light representing a life, a story, a struggle. How many of those stories, she wondered, mirrored her own? How many others had felt the weight of assumptions pressing down on them? Unseen but undeniable? The cabin grew quieter as passengers began to settle in for the night. A few rows ahead, a child's muffled laughter broke the stillness, followed by the soothing murmurs of a parent. It was a tender, fleeting moment that stood in stark contrast to the simmering tension Mia felt. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing the sound to ground her. When she opened them again, Samantha had returned. This time, she was serving drinks, her movements precise and practiced. Yet as she approached Mia's row, her demeanor shifted once more. Her smile, warm and inviting for other passengers, faded into something cooler and more perfunctory. "Would you like another drink?" Samantha asked, her tone devoid of the warmth she had shown just moments earlier. "No thank you," Mia replied, her voice calm. Samantha nodded curtly and moved on. But not before her gaze lingered on Mia's dress one last time. It wasn't a long look, but it was enough to reignite the quiet tension that had settled over the cabin. From the corner of her eye, Mia saw Agnes sit up straighter, her expression firm. For a moment, Mia thought the older woman might speak up again. But she remained silent, her hands folded neatly over her book. Mia returned her gaze to the window, her thoughts drifting to the case she was working on. The community she was representing, a small town fighting against corporate negligence, had faced its own share of quiet battles. Their struggle wasn't just about contaminated water, it was about the right to exist with dignity, to have their voices heard in a world that often chose to ignore them. The parallels weren't lost on her. Whether in a courtroom or a first-class cabin, the fight for respect often began in the smallest moments. It was in the way people spoke to one another, the way they looked or didn't look at each other. It was in the choice to speak up or to remain silent. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the beginning of the overnight portion of the flight. Mia adjusted her seat, preparing herself for the hours ahead. She knew that Samantha's actions, though seemingly small, carried a weight that could not be ignored. But she also knew that her response, calm, measured, and unwavering, was its own form of resistance. Justice, Mia thought, wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it was about enduring, about refusing to let others define your worth, about knowing that dignity, once claimed, could never truly be taken away. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang tiang on Viet Chuan 5 Hap Dan Quan Hut Nui Doc Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chuyen Con Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Then. Tram Lang. Nan Man Suma Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Bi Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hong Ge Dat Doi Tuong Nuanila Nui Sin Song Tam I Vako Du Tuoi Tren 65 Tuoi. Chat GPT de Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 5, The Turning Point. The airplane cabin had settled into a drowsy calm. The hum of the engines a steady backdrop to the muted shuffle of blankets and pillows. Most passengers had begun to drift off, their heads resting against windows or reclining seats. Yet for Justice Mia Caldwell, sleep was elusive. She sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, her thoughts circling the tension that still lingered from earlier interactions. Mia had learned to endure moments like these. Endurance, after all, had been a constant companion throughout her life. She had faced questions about her competence in law school, skepticism about her appointments, and assumptions about her worthiness in spaces she had every right to occupy. Each instance had been a test, a quiet battle against the unspoken boundaries others tried to impose. But tonight, on this flight, the test felt heavier. Perhaps it was the confinement of the airplane. The way there was no escape from the subtle microaggressions that seemed to hang in the air. Or perhaps it was the persistent presence of Samantha York, the flight attendant whose every interaction with Mia felt tinged with condescension. As if summoned by her thoughts, Samantha reappeared, her steps quick and purposeful as she moved down the aisle. She wasn't serving drinks or clearing trays this time. Instead, she stopped abruptly at Mia's row, her posture tense. "Excuse me, ma'am," Samantha said, her tone clipped. "I'll need to ask you to adjust your belongings. They're intruding into the aisle." Mia looked down. Her belongings, a neatly stowed bag beneath her seat and a folded blanket, were well within the designated space. There was nothing that could reasonably be described as an obstruction. She raised her gaze to Samantha, her expression calm but questioning. "My belongings are properly stored," Mia replied evenly. Her voice was soft, measured, but there was an unmistakable firmness beneath the words. Samantha's eyes narrowed slightly, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the irritation beneath. "I'll need you to check again," she insisted. A subtle murmur rippled through the nearby passengers. Across the aisle, Agnes Wright set aside her book, her gaze sharpening as she watched the exchange. The businessman seated next to Mia stirred, his brow furrowing as he glanced between Samantha and Mia. "There's no issue here," Mia said after a brief pause, her tone unwavering. "Perhaps you'd like to check with the passenger in front of me. Their bag is extending into the aisle." Samantha stiffened, the color rising in her cheeks. For a moment, it seemed she might press further. But then her gaze flickered to the watchful eyes of the passengers around her. The silence in the cabin had grown heavier, charged with unspoken tension. "Very well," Samantha said curtly. Turning on her heel, she pushed her cart down the aisle, her steps brisk and forceful. As she disappeared toward the galley, Agnes leaned slightly toward Mia. "That woman's got nerve," she said quietly, her voice a mixture of disapproval and sympathy. "I've seen a lot of things in my years of flying. But this? This is something else." Mia gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's not unusual," she replied softly. "These moments happen more often than most people realize." Agnes nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I believe you. I've kept quiet in the past. But maybe I shouldn't have." The quiet exchange was interrupted by the businessman, who cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've been sitting here the whole time, and I haven't seen anything out of order. If she comes back, I'll be sure to mention that." Mia turned to him, a small but genuine smile crossing her face. "Thank you," she said. "Your support means more than you know." The businessman nodded, his expression earnest. "It's the least I can do." The moment of solidarity, though brief, eased some of the tension Mia felt. It wasn't that she needed others to defend her, she had spent years learning how to stand firm on her own. But there was something profoundly affirming in knowing that others were willing to bear witness, to speak up when it mattered. As the cabin settled back into its quiet rhythm, Mia let her gaze drift to the window. The darkness outside was vast. The faint glow of distant cities barely visible beneath the clouds. It was a reminder of how small this moment was in the grand scheme of things, and yet it didn't feel small at all. She thought of the young women she often mentored. Those just beginning their journeys in the legal field. What would she tell them about tonight? That even at the pinnacle of success, these moments could still find you? That dignity wasn't something granted but something you had to claim for yourself. Over and over again? The thought brought both weariness and resolve. Mia knew that her fight wasn't just her own, it was part of a larger struggle. One that stretched back generations and would continue long after her time. It was about creating a world where no one had to justify their presence, their worth, or their belonging. Her reflections were interrupted by a soft voice from the aisle. "Ma'am?" Mia turned to see a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, standing hesitantly near her row. She held a phone in her hand, her expression a mix of determination and nervousness. "I've been watching," the woman said quietly. "And recording. If you need this, I'll send it to you." "What's been happening? It's not right." Mia studied the young woman, her heart swelling with gratitude and a touch of sadness. She didn't want to need the evidence, but she appreciated the gesture nonetheless. "Thank you," Mia said gently. "I hope we won't need it. But it's good to know someone is paying attention." The woman nodded, slipping back to her seat. Her presence, like that of Agnes and the businessman, was a quiet reminder that even in moments of adversity, there was strength in solidarity. Mia returned her gaze to the window, her reflection faintly visible against the darkness. The plane continued its journey, cutting through the night with quiet determination. And so did she. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang tiang on Viet Chuang 6 Hep Dan Quan Hut Nui Dak Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kak Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chuyen Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Then. Tram Lang. Nan Man Suma Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Bi Chung Tak Trong Doi Song Hong Ge Dat Doi Tuong Nuinila Nui Sin Song Tam I Vako Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. Chat GPT de Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 6 Accountability. The cabin lights dimmed further, casting soft shadows across the rows of seats. The hum of the engines, steady and unchanging, provided a backdrop to the quiet tension still lingering in the air. Justice Mia Caldwell closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a deep breath. She wasn't tired. Not in the conventional sense. But a different kind of weariness had settled over her, a heaviness born of the moment. Familiar and persistent. She adjusted the edge of her blanket, letting the fabric rest lightly over her lap. The dried stain on her dress was faint now, almost invisible. But to Mia, it symbolized more than spilled water. It was a mark of the evening. A quiet but undeniable reminder of how small acts of disrespect could leave lasting impressions. Samantha York reappeared, her presence announced by the sharp click of her heels against the cabin floor. She moved with purpose, her demeanor as polished as ever. But Mia noticed the stiffness in her movements. The earlier exchanges had shifted something not just between them, but in the cabin itself. Passengers who had been content to remain silent were now paying attention, their gazes flickering toward Samantha with subtle curiosity or disapproval. As Samantha neared Mia's row, she hesitated, her hands tightening on the handle of her cart. Her professional smile was in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. She avoided Mia's gaze, focusing instead on the tray she was collecting from the businessman seated beside her. Mia watched her, silent and steady. She had no intention of provoking another confrontation, but she also wouldn't shrink from the moment. Her composure was her shield, her quiet refusal to be diminished a form of resistance in itself. Samantha turned to Mia. Her movements deliberate but slightly hesitant. "Can I take anything for you?" she asked. Her tone carefully neutral. "No thank you," Mia replied. Her voice calm but firm. There was a pause. A fleeting moment of tension as their eyes met. Samantha looked away first, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the cart before she moved on. The interaction was brief, but it carried weight and acknowledgement. Perhaps that the balance of power had shifted, even if only slightly. Across the aisle, Agnes Wright observed the exchange with quiet intensity. Her book lay forgotten in her lap, her gaze fixed on Samantha as the flight attendant continued down the aisle. When Samantha disappeared into the galley, Agnes turned to Mia. "She knows she's been called out," Agnes said softly, her voice steady. "You didn't have to say much for her to realize it." Mia offered a faint smile. "Sometimes silence is more effective than words." Agnes nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's a shame it takes moments like this to make people see what's right in front of them." Mia didn't respond immediately. She let Agnes's words settle, their truth undeniable. The quiet, daily battles against prejudice often went unnoticed by those not directly affected. It wasn't until someone was forced to confront their own behavior or witness it reflected in another that they began to understand the harm such moments could cause. The cabin remained subdued, the passengers around them absorbed in their own thoughts or drifting off to sleep. Yet the atmosphere felt different now, charged with an awareness that hadn't been there before. The quiet murmurs and subtle glances spoke of a collective recognition, however small, that something significant had transpired. A young woman a few rows ahead, the same one who had earlier offered to record the interactions, stood briefly to adjust her bag in the overhead bin. Her movements were unremarkable, but Mia caught the way she glanced back, her eyes meeting Mia's for a fleeting moment. There was no need for words, the woman's expression said enough. "I see you." Mia returned her gaze to the window, the dark expanse of the sky stretching endlessly. The world outside was vast, its silence broken only by the faint glimmer of distant lights. It reminded her of the countless lives unfolding simultaneously, each carrying its own struggles and triumphs. How many others, she wondered, were grappling with the same quiet battles she faced tonight? The thought wasn't bitter, it was grounding. Mia had long accepted that her journey, while uniquely her own, was part of a much larger story. She carried the weight of her experiences not just for herself but for those who might one day walk a similar path. It was a responsibility she embraced, though it often came with a cost. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. Samantha had returned, her posture less confident than before. She stopped a few rows away, speaking quietly to a colleague before approaching Mia once more. This time, there was no cart, no pretense of routine service. Samantha's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her expression strained. "Ma'am," Samantha began, her voice low but audible enough for those nearby to hear. "I'd like to apologize for earlier. I may have been out of line." The words, though hesitant, carried a weight that stilled the air around them. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen now shifted subtly in their seats, their attention drawn to the exchange. Mia regarded Samantha for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She could sense the discomfort in the flight attendant's stance, the way her hands fidgeted and her eyes darted briefly to the floor. It wasn't a full reckoning, Mia knew, but it was a start. "Thank you," Mia said finally, her voice calm but firm. "I hope this is a moment you'll reflect on." Samantha nodded, her posture stiff. "Yes, ma'am," she said, before retreating to the galley. As the cabin settled once more, Mia leaned back in her seat, her gaze returning to the window. The interaction, brief as it was, had left her with a mix of emotions. Satisfaction, perhaps, that Samantha had acknowledged her actions, but also a lingering sadness that such moments were still necessary. Agnes spoke again, her voice quiet but resolute. "You handled that with more grace than most people would." Mia smiled faintly. "Grace isn't always easy, but it's necessary." The older woman nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I hope she learns from this," Agnes said. "Not just for your sake, but for the next person she encounters." Mia let the words linger, knowing their truth. Tonight's events wouldn't change the world, but they might change one person. And sometimes, that was enough to begin. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang tiang on Viet Chuang 7 hap dan quan hut nuoi dak bang jong van tram lang. Kak quan, jong van qua ka chuyen kong qua kich tin ma ko fan ben then. Tram lang. Nan man suma thuan gam qua van de fan bi chung tak trong doi song hong ge dat doi tuong nuin ila nuoi sin song tam I vako du tuoi trend 65 tuoi. Chat GPT de Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 7, Aftermath. The cabin lights dimmed to their lowest setting as the plane entered its final hours in the air. The rhythmic hum of the engines provided a steady background to the muffled quiet of passengers who had settled into sleep or the glow of personal screens. For Justice Mia Caldwell, the stillness was welcome, though it did little to ease her thoughts. She adjusted her blanket and stared out the window at the darkness beyond. The stars, faint but persistent, flickered against the vast emptiness. It reminded her of how life could sometimes feel small and insignificant against the weight of the world's challenges, yet resilient and unyielding. The earlier exchange with Samantha York lingered in her mind, not for its confrontation, but for what it represented. The flight attendant's apology had been a moment of accountability, however tentative, and it left Mia wondering about its sincerity. Would Samantha reflect on her actions? Or would she simply dismiss the evening as an uncomfortable encounter best forgotten? Mia had seen both outcomes before, and experience had taught her to measure progress in small, quiet steps rather than sweeping change. Across the aisle, Agnes Wright was still awake, her book now resting closed on the tray table. She caught Mia's gaze and gave a slight nod, her expression soft with understanding. "I hope you're able to rest," Agnes said gently. "You've carried enough tonight." Mia offered a faint smile. "Rest doesn't always come easily," she replied. "But thank you." Agnes leaned back in her seat, her eyes thoughtful. "You remind me of my granddaughter," she said after a pause. "She's in her first year of law school. Ambitious. Determined. She wants to change the world. She'll need that determination." Mia said quietly. "The world doesn't change easily." Agnes sighed, a wistful sound that carried the weight of years. "It doesn't. But sometimes it bends. Doesn't it? Even if only a little." Mia nodded, appreciating the sentiment. She thought of her own journey, the countless moments where she had pushed against a system that wasn't designed to include her. Each victory had felt like bending the world, if only slightly, toward a more just path. The sound of footsteps broke the quiet as another flight attendant approached. It was Emily, the kind attendant who had offered Mia a fresh drink earlier in the flight. Her demeanor, warm and genuine, stood in stark contrast to Samantha's earlier froideur. "Ma'am," Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper so as not to disturb the sleeping passengers. "I wanted to check if there's anything you need before we prepare for landing." Mia shook her head. No thank you. I'm fine. Emily hesitated, her eyes searching Mia's face as though she wanted to say more. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what you've experienced tonight. It's not how things should be. Mia regarded her, noting the sincerity in her expression. Thank you, Emily, she said. Your kindness hasn't gone unnoticed. Emily gave a small, grateful nod before retreating to the galley. Her presence, though brief, was a reminder that there were always individuals willing to step up, even in small ways. It was these quiet acts of humanity that often meant the most. Mia turned her attention back to the window, her reflection faint against the glass. The person she saw was familiar. Yet tonight she felt the weight of her role in a way she hadn't in years. She wasn't just a Supreme Court justice on this flight, she was a witness. A participant in an ongoing struggle that stretched beyond her position and into the fabric of everyday life. She thought of the young woman with the phone, who had recorded the interactions earlier. It wasn't the first time Mia had been aware of someone documenting her experiences. But it still unsettled her. The thought of becoming a moment in someone else's narrative was one she carried carefully, knowing how stories could shift and change depending on who told them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the businessman seated beside her. He cleared his throat softly, turning to her with a hesitant expression. I wanted to say, he began, his voice low. I regret not speaking up sooner. I saw what was happening. And I should have done more. Mia studied him for a moment, her expression calm but contemplative. It's not easy to know when to act, she said finally. But recognizing it now is a start. He nodded, relief softening his features. I'll remember that, he said. And I'll do better next time. Mia gave him a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough, a moment of reflection. A quiet acknowledgement that change often began with recognition. The plane began its gradual descent, the cabin lights brightening slightly as passengers stirred. The usual pre-landing bustle resumed. But there was an undercurrent of calm, as though the events of the evening had left an imprint not just on Mia, but on those who had witnessed it. As the wheels touched down with a soft bump, Mia felt a sense of grounding she hadn't realized she needed. The journey was ending, but its lessons would linger. She glanced at Agnes, who offered her a warm smile. Safe travels, Justice Caldwell, Agnes said as they prepared to disembark. And thank you. Mia nodded, her voice steady as she replied. Safe travels to you too, Agnes. And thank you for everything. As Mia stepped into the terminal, the cool air of the jet bridge greeted her, a stark contrast to the enclosed warmth of the plane. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Ahead of her was another day, another set of challenges. But tonight, she carried with her the quiet strength of those who had stood with her, and the resolve to continue bending the world, moment by moment, toward justice. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang tiang on via chuang 8 hap dan quan hat nuoi dak bang jong van tram lang. Kak quan, jong van qua ka chuyen kong qua kich tin ma ko fan ben then. Tram lang. Nan man suma thuan gam qua van de fan bi chung tak trong doi song hong ge dat doi tuong nuanila nuoi sin song tam I vako du tuoi trend 65 tuoi. Chat GPT de Noi. Chat GPT. Chapter 8, A World Still Turning. The cool, polished floors of the airport terminal gleamed under fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the muted atmosphere of the airplane cabin. Justice Mia Caldwell moved with quiet purpose, her briefcase steady in her hand, her steps measured. Around her, The terminal buzzed with the familiar rhythm of travelers' families reuniting. Announcements echoing. Hurried steps toward distant gates. It was a world that kept turning, seemingly unaffected by the quiet tensions of earlier hours. Yet, as Mia walked, she carried the weight of the flight with her, a reminder of the many ways those small, unspoken struggles could ripple outward, leaving marks on both those who experienced them and those who bore witness. The young woman with the phone lingered near the gate, her expression a mix of hesitation and resolve. When Mia met her gaze, the woman approached, her phone still in hand. "I didn't know if I should say something," the woman began, her voice low but steady. "But I want you to know I recorded what happened. If you need it for anything, it's yours." Mia studied her, sensing the sincerity behind the words. The offer was well-meaning, but it came with its own complications. She had seen how these moments could spiral once they entered the public eye, often shifting focus from the issue itself to the spectacle of it all. "Thank you," Mia said, her tone calm. "But I think the most important thing we can do is learn from it. Use it to teach, not to punish." The woman nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I just didn't want it to be forgotten." "It won't be," Mia assured her. "Moments like these leave a mark, even if they don't always feel like it right away." The woman smiled faintly, then stepped back, giving Mia a quiet nod before disappearing into the flow of passengers. As Mia continued toward the exit, her thoughts turned to the conversation with Samantha York. The flight attendant's apology had been halting, uncertain, but there had been something genuine in her demeanor. Whether it would lead to meaningful change remained to be seen. Experience had taught Mia that accountability was a process, not a moment. People needed time to reflect, to confront their assumptions and decide whether to carry that awareness forward. At the curb outside, her driver stood waiting, his expression calm but alert. The city lights blurred in the distance, their glow diffused by the cool night air. As Mia slid into the back seat, the familiar scent of leather and the quiet hum of the car's engine brought a sense of normalcy. Yet the evening's events lingered, refusing to settle. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through emails from her clerks about the week ahead. Court schedules, speaking engagements, and case briefs filled her inbox, a world of structured order waiting for her return. But her focus remained on the night's quieter lessons, the kind that couldn't be captured in legal opinions or courtroom rulings. Justice wasn't always about the cases that made headlines or the sweeping decisions that shaped the law. It lived in the everyday moments where dignity was challenged and upheld, where silence was broken by the simple act of standing firm. It was in the way Agnes Wright had spoken up, in the quiet support of the young woman with her phone, in the businessman's hesitant acknowledgement of his own inaction. The car rolled smoothly through the streets, the city unfolding around her. Mia thought of the people she had met on the flight, their lives intersecting with hers for a brief, charged moment. Each of them carried their own experiences, their own understanding of what had happened. Some, like Agnes, had stepped forward, while others had stayed silent, unsure of their role. And then there was Samantha. Mia wondered what the flight attendant was thinking now, whether the weight of the evening would stay with her or fade as she moved on to the next flight, the next set of passengers. Change, Mia knew, often came in fits and starts. But every moment of reckoning, no matter how small, planted a seed. The car slowed to a stop in front of her home, a quiet townhouse nestled in a tree-lined street. Mia stepped out, the chill of the night air brushing against her skin. As she climbed the steps, she glanced up at the sky. The stars faint but steady, They reminded her of the work that lay ahead, constant, enduring, sometimes imperceptible but always moving forward. Inside, she set her briefcase on the table and poured herself a cup of tea. The house was silent, save for the soft ticking of a clock in the corner. It was a comforting stillness, one that gave her space to reflect. She thought of the young women she often mentored, those just beginning their own journeys. What would she tell them about tonight? She would tell them that justice wasn't confined to courtrooms. It was found in the quiet resolve to hold your ground, in the courage to confront prejudice with dignity, and in the willingness to learn from moments of discomfort. She would tell them that the work of bending the world toward fairness was slow and unglamorous, but it was work worth doing. Sipping her tea, Mia reached for her notebook. She began drafting notes for her next lecture, weaving in the lessons of the evening. It wasn't just about the law, it was about the humanity behind it. The choices people made in small, fleeting moments that defined who they were and what they believed. The pen moved steadily across the page, her thoughts taking shape in quiet, deliberate strokes. Somewhere, Samantha York might be reflecting on the flight. And perhaps the businessman was considering what he might do differently next time. Mia didn't know what their journeys would look like, but she carried hope that they, too, would find ways to bend the world, even slightly, towards something better. The stars continued their slow, silent dance across the sky as Mia wrote. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to shape the law. But tonight, she found comfort in the stillness, in the knowledge that even the smallest actions could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she might never fully see. Justice, she thought, wasn't just an outcome. It was a process, a commitment, a way of being. And it was a journey she was determined to continue.